The summer sun blazed over the ancient cobblestone streets of London as thousands of tourists gathered along the parade route. Among them stood Marcus Chen, a 32-year-old businessman from California, who had flown across the Atlantic for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. He had spent the morning exploring the historic sites, his camera clicking constantly as he tried to capture every moment of his first trip to England. Marcus had started his day with a traditional English breakfast at a small pub near his hotel. The elderly owner, a friendly man named George, had recommended that Marcus visit Buckingham Palace to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. It was one of those quintessential British experiences that no tourist should miss, George had insisted with a warm smile. Marcus had thanked him and set off with excitement bubbling in his chest. However, what George didn't know was that Marcus had made a detour before reaching the palace. He had stumbled upon a street festival celebrating a local community event. The atmosphere was electric with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Colorful banners hung from building to building, and vendors sold everything from fish and chips to handmade crafts. The smell of fried food mixed with the sweet aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the air. At one of the beverage stalls, Marcus had been offered a sample of traditional English ale. The vendor, a jovial man with a thick beard and rosy cheeks, explained that this particular brew was made using a recipe that dated back 300 years. Marcus, always eager to experience local culture, had accepted enthusiastically. One sample led to another, and before he knew it, he had purchased several pints. The ale was stronger than the beers he was used to back home, but it tasted smooth and went down easily under the warm afternoon sun. As the festival buzzed around him, Marcus found himself chatting with other tourists and locals alike. A group of Australian backpackers shared stories of their travels across Europe. An elderly British couple reminisced about how the neighborhood had changed over the decades. Everyone seemed so friendly and welcoming that Marcus felt completely at ease. He lost track of time as he continued drinking, the alcohol slowly clouding his judgment without him fully realizing it. By the time Marcus checked his watch, he realized with a jolt that the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. He quickly said his goodbyes to his new acquaintances and hurried toward Buckingham Palace. His steps were slightly unsteady, and the world seemed to have taken on a softer, dreamlike quality. He attributed it to the excitement and the heat rather than acknowledging how much he had actually drunk. The crowd near the palace was massive. People from every corner of the globe had gathered to witness the famous ceremony. Children sat on their parents' shoulders waving small British flags. Tour guides spoke in a dozen different languages, explaining the history and significance of the tradition to their groups. Street performers entertained those waiting in line, juggling and playing musical instruments for spare change. Marcus pushed his way through the throng, trying to get a better view. His usually polite demeanor had been replaced by a more aggressive assertiveness fueled by alcohol. He bumped into people without apologizing, earning annoyed glances and muttered complaints. A woman with a stroller gave him a particularly stern look when he nearly knocked into her child, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind was fixed on one thing, getting the perfect photograph of the royal guards. The ceremony began with the sound of military drums echoing through the air. The crowd fell into an awed silence as the guards emerged in their iconic red uniforms and tall bearskin hats. They marched in perfect formation, their movements precise and synchronized like a well-oiled machine. The sight was truly magnificent, a living piece of history unfolding before thousands of eyes. Marcus raised his camera, but his hands were shaking slightly. He struggled to focus the lens, frustrated that he couldn't seem to capture the moment properly. The guards marched closer and the crowd pressed forward, everyone trying to get a better look. Marcus felt someone push him from behind and he stumbled forward, catching himself at the last moment. That's when he saw him. A royal guard stood near the edge of the parade route, positioned as a sentinel. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with a stern expression fixed on his face. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp and deliberate. He stood motionless, staring straight ahead as he had been trained to do, ignoring the cameras and the excited chatter of the tourists around him. Something about the guard's rigid posture annoyed Marcus in his intoxicated state. He found it absurd that someone would stand so still, so serious when surrounded by such festivity. The rational part of his brain, The part that would normally remind him to be respectful had been drowned in ale. Instead, a reckless idea began to form in his clouded mind. Marcus took a few steps closer to the guard, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. Other tourists nearby began to notice his approach, sensing that something was about to happen. A teenage boy whispered to his friend, pointing at Marcus. An older gentleman shook his head disapprovingly, recognizing the telltale signs of intoxication in Marcus's unsteady gait. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. He had been trained to ignore distractions, to maintain his composure no matter what happened around him. It was a matter of discipline and pride. These guards were not just ceremonial decorations, they were highly trained soldiers who took their duty seriously. Marcus was now standing just a few feet away from the guard. He swayed slightly, a foolish grin spreading across his face. Some people in the crowd began to back away, sensing trouble. Others pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever was about to unfold. The atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to tense in a matter of seconds. What Marcus failed to understand in his drunken state was the gravity of what he was about to do. These guards were not actors in costume but real military personnel, protecting one of the most important landmarks in the United Kingdom. They had the authority to use force if necessary, and they would not hesitate to do so if someone threatened the security of the area or interfered with their duties. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the crowd, and the drums kept their steady rhythm. But for Marcus Chen, standing there in front of the royal guard with alcohol coursing through his veins, everything was about to change. The decision he was about to make would transform his relaxing vacation into a nightmare he would never forget. The consequences of his actions would be swift, severe, and captured on dozens of cameras for the world to see. As Marcus raised his hand and reached toward the guard, the tension in the air became almost palpable. This was the moment when everything would go terribly wrong. Marcus's hand connected with the guard's shoulder, giving him a firm shove. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound that rippled through the gathering like a wave. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The guard stumbled slightly but maintained his footing, his expression unchanging. However, something had shifted in his eyes. What Marcus couldn't see through his alcoholic haze was the steel resolve that now burned behind that professional facade. The surrounding tourists immediately began recording on their phones. A woman from Japan whispered urgently to her husband in their native language. A family from India pulled their children back instinctively. Everyone sensed that Marcus had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The cheerful atmosphere of the ceremony had been shattered by one thoughtless act. Marcus, emboldened by the guard's initial lack of reaction, laughed. It was a loud, careless laugh that echoed inappropriately through the now silent crowd. He turned to the people around him as if expecting them to share in his amusement. Instead, he was met with shocked faces and disapproving stares. An elderly British woman shook her head in disgust, muttering something about disrespectful tourists under her breath. What happened next occurred so quickly that most people barely had time to process it. The guard, following his training and protocol, issued a loud, commanding shout. His voice boomed across the parade ground with an authority that made several children burst into tears. The warning was clear and unmistakable. Step back immediately. But Marcus, his reflexes dulled by alcohol and his judgment completely impaired, didn't move fast enough. Other guards in the vicinity had already noticed the disturbance. They moved with the efficiency of a well-trained unit, communicating through subtle signals and quick glances. Two guards began marching toward Marcus's position, their boots striking the cobblestones with purposeful thuds. The tourists scrambled to clear a path, parents pulling children out of the way, elderly visitors shuffling aside as quickly as their legs could carry them. Marcus finally seemed to grasp that he was in trouble. His smile faded, replaced by a confused, frightened expression. He took a stumbling step backward, but his coordination was severely compromised. His foot caught on an uneven cobblestone and he lost his balance. As he windmilled his arms trying to steady himself, he accidentally knocked into another tourist, a teenage girl who yelped in surprise. The royal guard whom Marcus had shoved stepped forward. His face remained impassive, but his actions spoke volumes. He moved with the precision of a trained soldier, closing the distance between himself and Marcus in 3 long strides. Marcus tried to retreat further, his hands raised in a gesture that was meant to be placating but came across as clumsy and desperate. Security personnel in civilian clothes had also converged on the scene. They had been stationed throughout the crowd, virtually invisible until this moment. Now they emerged like ghosts, speaking into radios and coordinating with the uniformed guards. The entire response system had been activated by Marcus's single foolish act. Marcus attempted to speak, to explain that it was just a joke, that he meant no harm. The words came out slurred and incoherent. He tried to back away more quickly, but the crowd behind him had formed a solid wall. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped in a situation entirely of his own making, with dozens of cameras capturing every moment of his humiliation and fear. The guard's training dictated his next move. When someone physically assaults a Queen's Guard and fails to comply with warnings, they are considered a potential threat to security. The guard's duty was clear. He needed to neutralize the threat and ensure that the dignity of the ceremony and the security of the location were maintained. Personal feelings didn't matter. This was about duty, discipline, and the preservation of centuries-old traditions. Marcus saw the guard approaching and panic truly set in. The alcohol that had made him feel so brave and invincible now betrayed him, making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. He tried to dodge to the left, then to the right, but there was no escape route. The crowd had formed a tight circle around him, not out of malice, but simply because everyone wanted to see what would happen next. A man from Germany, who had been filming the entire incident, would later post the video online where it would be viewed millions of times. In that footage, Marcus can be seen pleading with the guard, his face flushed red from both alcohol and fear. The guard's expression remains unchanged, a mask of professional neutrality that somehow makes the situation even more intimidating. Other tourists began shouting advice to Marcus. Some told him to run, though there was clearly nowhere to run to. Others yelled at him to apologize, to get on his knees and beg for forgiveness. A few people seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Their faces lit up with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing something shocking and unprecedented. Marcus dropped to his knees. Whether intentionally or because his legs simply gave out was unclear. He clasped his hands together in front of him, mimicking a prayer gesture. His mouth moved, forming words that might have been apologies or pleas for mercy. Tears began streaming down his face, cutting paths through the sweat on his cheeks. The reality of his situation had finally penetrated through the fog of alcohol. The guard stood over him now, an imposing figure in his red uniform and towering bearskin hat. From Marcus's perspective on the ground, the guard seemed to be 10 feet tall, an implacable force of tradition and authority. The shadow cast by the guard's hat fell across Marcus's face, and in that shadow, Marcus saw his life flashing before his eyes. Behind the guard, his fellow soldiers maintained their formation, continuing the ceremony as if nothing had happened. This was part of their training, too. The show must go on regardless of disruptions. The drums continued their steady beat. The flags waved in the summer breeze. Life went on for everyone except Marcus, whose world had narrowed to this single terrifying moment. The security personnel were now in position around the perimeter of the incident. They spoke quietly into their radios, coordinating with police officers who were making their way through the dense crowd. The response to Marcus's actions was escalating with each passing second. What had started as a drunken prank was rapidly transforming into a serious security incident with potential legal ramifications. Marcus's camera, still hanging around his neck, banged against his chest as he trembled. The photographs he had wanted so badly to take now seemed pathetically unimportant. He would have given anything to turn back time, to be standing at that festival again with a choice. Drink more ale, or head to the palace sober. The path not taken now seemed impossibly precious. The crowd had grown eerily quiet. Even the children had stopped crying, sensing the gravity of the moment. All eyes were fixed on Marcus and the guard, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was unbearable, a thick presence that seemed to squeeze the air from everyone's lungs. This was history in the making, though not the kind anyone wanted to be part of. Marcus closed his eyes, unable to bear the weight of all those stares, all those camera lenses pointed at him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he prayed to whatever gods might be listening. He prayed for mercy, for understanding, for a second chance. But prayers, he was about to learn, don't always get answered the way we hope. The guard's voice cut through the air like a blade. He issued a final warning in a tone that brooked no argument, commanding Marcus to move immediately from the parade route. Marcus scrambled to comply, his hands and knees scraping against the rough cobblestones as he tried to crawl backward. But he wasn't moving fast enough, and more critically, he was still in the ceremonial path where the guards needed to march. What Marcus failed to understand in his terrified, intoxicated state was that the Royal Guard's march route was sacred. These men were not going to deviate from their path, not for a tourist, not for anyone. Their duty was to maintain the precision and dignity of a ceremony that had been performed the same way for generations. To alter their course would be to admit that an unruly visitor could disrupt centuries of tradition. The guard began his march forward. His steps were measured and deliberate, the same pace he had maintained throughout the entire ceremony. He wasn't rushing toward Marcus in anger or vengeance. He was simply continuing his duty, following the route he had been assigned. It just so happened that Marcus was now directly in that route, and Marcus wasn't moving out of the way quickly enough. Other tourists started screaming warnings at Marcus. A woman from France shouted at him in accented English to move. A Canadian man gestured frantically, pointing to the side where Marcus needed to go. Children covered their eyes while peeking through their fingers, unable to look away from the impending collision. The atmosphere had transformed from tense to absolutely terrifying. Marcus looked up and saw the guard bearing down on him. His alcohol-soaked brain couldn't quite process what was happening. He had expected anger, maybe physical restraint by security, possibly arrest. What he hadn't expected was this methodical, unstoppable approach. The guard's face showed no emotion, no fury, no satisfaction. There was only duty, pure and simple. Marcus tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The alcohol, the fear, and the adrenaline coursing through his system had created a perfect storm of physical incompetence. He managed to get one foot under him before stumbling again. His camera swung wildly, nearly hitting him in the face. The strap dug into his neck as he thrashed about, trying desperately to clear the guard's path. The first impact came when the guard's boot connected with Marcus's shoulder. It wasn't a kick in the traditional sense. The guard simply maintained his march, and Marcus happened to be in the way. But the force was considerable. These guards wore heavy boots designed for long marches on hard surfaces. The impact sent Marcus sprawling to the side, a cry of pain escaping his lips. The crowd's reaction was mixed and immediate. Some people gasped in horror, their hands flying to their mouths. Others nodded in grim satisfaction, feeling that Marcus was getting exactly what he deserved for his disrespectful behavior. A few tourists looked away, unable to watch what was unfolding. But most continued filming, their phones and cameras capturing every brutal second. Marcus rolled to his side, clutching his shoulder where the boot had struck him. For a moment it seemed like that might be the end of it. He was out of the direct path now, off to the side where he couldn't interfere with the ceremony. But in his panic and pain, Marcus made another critical error. He tried to stand up again directly in front of another approaching guard. This second guard was even taller than the first, the imposing figure whose bearskin hat seemed to scrape the sky. He had witnessed the entire incident and had received no orders to deviate from his route. His expression was carved from stone, completely impassive as he approached the spot where Marcus was struggling to his feet. The guard's pace never faltered, never hesitated. He was a force of nature as inevitable as the tides. Marcus's eyes widened as he realized his mistake. He was still in the parade route, and this guard wasn't going to stop either. He tried to throw himself to the side, but his body wouldn't respond with the speed necessary. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion and impossibly fast at the same time. His mind screamed at his limbs to move, but the signals were lost somewhere in the fog of alcohol and terror. The guard's boot came down on Marcus's leg. The weight of a fully grown man in military gear, combined with the momentum of a practiced march, created devastating force. Marcus screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the palace walls. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, sharp and all-consuming. His leg felt like it was on fire, as if every nerve was simultaneously reporting damage. Marcus collapsed completely now, all attempts at standing abandoned. He curled into a fetal position, his hands protectively covering his head. Tears flowed freely down his face, mixing with the dirt and sweat already there. He was crying openly, all pride and bravado stripped away by pain and humiliation. This was no longer about a silly prank or a drunken mistake. This was about survival. The guards continued their march. A third one was approaching now, and Marcus was still partially in the path. He tried to roll away, using every ounce of strength his battered body could muster. His shoulder throbbed. His legs screamed in protest with every movement. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the fear of being trampled again gave him the energy he needed to move a few more inches to the side. This third guard adjusted his path ever so slightly. It was the smallest of deviations, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for it, but it was enough. The guard's boot came down inches from Marcus's head, close enough that Marcus could hear the leather striking the cobblestone, close enough to feel the vibration through the ground. It was a warning and a mercy all at once. Security personnel finally reached Marcus. 2 men in dark suits knelt beside him, their hands firm but not rough as they pulled him completely off the parade route. Marcus didn't resist. He couldn't have resisted even if he'd wanted to. His body was a map of pain, every movement bringing fresh waves of agony. He whimpered as they lifted him, supporting his weight between them. The ceremony continued unabated. The guards marched on, their formation perfect, their timing impeccable. To them, Marcus had been nothing more than a temporary obstacle, dealt with and now forgotten. The drums beat their steady rhythm. The flags waved proudly in the breeze. The tourist, who had been far enough away to miss the details of the incident, continued taking photos, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. But for those who had witnessed it up close, the memory would last forever. A mother held her sobbing daughter, trying to explain why the guard had done what he did. An elderly man shook his head, muttering about how tourists these days had no respect. The German man who had filmed everything reviewed his footage with wide eyes, already imagining the views his video would get online. Marcus was pulled to a clear area behind the crowd. A police car was already approaching, its lights flashing but its siren mercifully silent. The officers emerged with practiced efficiency. They had dealt with incidents at the palace before, though rarely one quite this dramatic. One officer began asking Marcus questions while another called for medical assistance. Marcus could barely speak. The pain had intensified now that the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. His shoulder felt like it was filled with broken glass. His leg was swelling visibly, the fabric of his pants stretching tight over what was surely massive bruising. Every breath hurt. Every heartbeat sent fresh pulses of pain through his nervous system. A paramedic arrived within minutes, her face professional and focused as she knelt beside Marcus. She began examining his injuries, her hands gentle but thorough. Marcus winced and gasped as she palpated his shoulder and leg. She asked him questions about his pain level, about his medical history, about allergies to medications. Marcus answered as best he could between gritted teeth. The police officer who had been taking notes asked Marcus if he had been drinking. The question was almost unnecessary given the smell of alcohol that still clung to Marcus like a cloud. But protocol demanded it be asked. Marcus nodded miserably, admitting to the several pints of ale he had consumed at the festival. The officer wrote this down, his expression neutral but his eyes showing a hint of disappointment. Around them, the ceremony was concluding. The guards were completing their final formation, preparing to march back to their posts. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered to discuss what they had witnessed. Some people approached the police to offer statements as witnesses. Others hurried away, eager to post their videos and photos online before anyone else could. Marcus lay on the ground, staring up at the sky, wondering how his dream vacation had turned into a nightmare. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, weaving through the dispersing crowd with careful precision. By then, Marcus had been moved to a sitting position against a stone wall, a borrowed jacket draped over his shoulders despite the warm weather. He was shivering uncontrollably, a combination of shock, pain, and the sobering reality of his situation sinking in. The paramedic had given him preliminary treatment, applying cold packs to his injuries and checking his vital signs repeatedly. 2 paramedics emerged from the ambulance carrying equipment. They introduced themselves with calm professionalism, their voices soothing in contrast to the chaos that still buzzed around the scene. The female paramedic, whose name tag read Sarah, began asking Marcus detailed questions about his injuries while her partner James prepared a stretcher. Marcus tried to focus on answering, but his thoughts kept drifting to the videos he had seen being recorded, to the faces of the people who had watched him being trampled, to the disappointed look in the police officer's eyes. As they loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, pain shot through his entire body. He cried out despite trying to be brave, his face contorting in agony. Sarah held his hand firmly, telling him to breathe through the pain, that they would have him comfortable soon. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens, concerned voices, and the ceiling of the ambulance passing overhead. Marcus closed his eyes, wishing he could close them and wake up in his hotel room, discovering that this had all been a terrible nightmare. The hospital's emergency department was busy with the usual afternoon rush. Marcus was wheeled through corridors painted in pale green, past rooms filled with other patients dealing with their own emergencies. He caught glimpses of families waiting anxiously, of doctors and nurses moving with purposeful haste, of medical equipment that beeped and hummed. A nurse took his details while another checked his injuries, both working with the efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times before. Dr. Amanda Reynolds was the physician who examined Marcus. She was in her early 40s with kind eyes that had seen countless injuries and countless stories behind those injuries. She listened without judgment as Marcus, now significantly more sober and infinitely more ashamed, explained what had happened. She probed his shoulder gently, noting his sharp intakes of breath. She examined his leg carefully, ordering x-rays to determine the extent of the damage. The x-ray technician was a young man named Tom, who tried to make small talk as he positioned Marcus for the images. But Marcus couldn't engage in casual conversation. His mind was spiraling through the consequences of his actions. Would he be arrested? Would he be deported? Would this follow him back to California? His company had strict policies about employee conduct, especially when traveling internationally. What would his boss say when he found out? The x-rays revealed extensive bruising but no broken bones. Marcus should have felt relieved by this news, but relief was impossible when faced with the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Reynolds explained that he had deep tissue contusions on both his shoulder and leg. The pain would persist for weeks. He would need physical therapy. There would be significant bruising that would take even longer to fade. She prescribed pain medication and anti-inflammatories, her tone professional but not unkind. While Marcus was being treated, the police investigation was proceeding. Officer David Thompson, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, had been assigned to handle the case. He had watched the videos that witnesses had already uploaded online. They had gone viral with shocking speed, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views within the first hour. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, with some people expressing sympathy for Marcus, while others celebrated his comeuppance. Officer Thompson arrived at the hospital as Marcus was being discharged from the emergency department. He was a tall man with graying hair and a face that had seen far too much of humanity's worst behavior. He requested to speak with Marcus privately, and a nurse directed them to a small consultation room. Marcus limped painfully, his shoulder throbbing with each step, his leg barely supporting his weight despite the painkillers. The interview was formal and thorough. Officer Thompson explained that Marcus was being charged with assault on a member of the armed forces and public disorder. These were serious offenses with potentially severe penalties. Marcus's face paled as the officer outlined the legal process ahead. There would be a court appearance. There could be fines, possibly even jail time. At minimum, Marcus was looking at a criminal record in the United Kingdom. Marcus tried to explain his state of mind, the alcohol, the heat, the momentary lapse in judgment. But his explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. Officer Thompson listened patiently, taking notes, but his expression made it clear that intoxication was not a valid defense. If anything, it made the situation worse. Marcus had chosen to drink, had chosen to approach the guard, had chosen to commit an act of disrespect and aggression. The consequences were his to bear. The officer also informed Marcus that he would need to surrender his passport. He was not to leave the United Kingdom until his court case was resolved. Marcus's heart sank further. He had been scheduled to fly home in 3 days. He had a crucial presentation at work next week. He had responsibilities, commitments, a life back in California that was now hanging in the balance, all of it jeopardized by a few moments of drunken stupidity. When Officer Thompson left, Marcus was alone in the small room with his thoughts and his pain. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and saw dozens of missed calls and messages. His parents had called repeatedly. His sister had sent worried texts. His best friend had forwarded him one of the videos with a simple message asking if it was really him. Most devastating was a voicemail from his boss, the tone cold and formal. requesting Marcus call him immediately. Marcus couldn't bring himself to call anyone back yet. Instead, he opened social media and was confronted with his own face staring back at him. The videos were everywhere. News outlets had picked up the story. Headlines screamed about the drunk tourist who attacked a royal guard. Comment sections were filled with thousands of people debating his actions, analyzing his choices, judging his character based on one terrible decision. Some comments showed a sliver of compassion, noting that everyone makes mistakes, that the punishment seemed harsh for what was essentially a prank gone wrong. But these voices were drowned out by the majority who felt Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved. They called him names, questioned his intelligence, his upbringing, his worth as a human being. Some comments were so vicious that Marcus had to stop reading, tears blurring his vision. A nurse knocked on the door, startling Marcus out of his misery. She handed him his discharge papers, a prescription, and information about follow-up care. She also gave him a pamphlet about victim support services, which Marcus found darkly ironic. He was no victim here. He was the perpetrator, the aggressor, the fool who had brought all of this upon himself. Marcus left the hospital as evening was falling over London. The summer sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, beautiful in a way that seemed to mock his suffering. He hailed a taxi, the simple act of raising his arm sending pain shooting through his shoulder. The driver recognized him immediately from the videos, his eyes widening in the rearview mirror. But to the driver's credit, he said nothing, simply drove Marcus back to his hotel in awkward silence. The hotel lobby was busy with guests checking in and out, chatting cheerfully about their plans for the evening. Marcus kept his head down, limping toward the elevators as quickly as his injured leg would allow. He was terrified of being recognized, of facing more judgment from strangers. His room, when he finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary. He locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to remove his shoes. The pain medication was starting to wear off, and the throbbing in his shoulder and leg was intensifying. Marcus took the pills the hospital had provided and lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. His phone continued to buzz with notifications, but he ignored them all. Tomorrow he would have to face the consequences. Tomorrow he would have to call his parents, his boss, a lawyer. Tomorrow he would have to begin the process of trying to repair the damage he had done to his life. But tonight Marcus simply lay in the dark and cried. He cried for his own stupidity, for the pain that pulsed through his body, for the life he had jeopardized with a few seconds of drunken arrogance. He cried until exhaustion finally claimed him, pulling him into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of marching guards and endless crowds pointing and laughing. The worst part of the nightmare was that when he woke up, the nightmare would still be real. Morning came too quickly and too harshly. Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through curtains he had forgotten to close, his body stiff and screaming with pain. For a blissful moment he didn't remember where he was or what had happened. Then memory crashed down on him like a physical weight and he groaned aloud. His phone showed 43 missed calls and over 100 text messages. There was no avoiding reality any longer. He started with his parents. His mother answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry and disappointment. She had seen the videos, as had everyone they knew back home. His father took the phone, his tone stern but concerned, demanding to know what Marcus had been thinking. Marcus had no good answer. He apologized repeatedly, his voice breaking as he tried to explain the inexplicable. His mother cried. His father lectured. They both promised to help however they could, despite their obvious disappointment. The call with his boss was far worse. Richard Martinez was a no-nonsense manager who valued professionalism above all else. His voice was ice-cold as he informed Marcus that the company was placing him on immediate unpaid leave, pending an internal investigation. The videos reflected poorly on the entire organization, Richard explained, and there would need to be serious discussions about Marcus's future with the firm. Marcus had worked at the company for 8 years, building his career step by careful step. Now it was all in jeopardy. Marcus hired a solicitor named Patricia Okonkwo, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who specialized in tourist-related offenses. She had seen cases like his before, though rarely ones that had garnered such intense media attention. During their first meeting in her small office near the courthouse, Patricia laid out Marcus's options with unflinching honesty. He could plead guilty and hope for leniency, or he could fight the charges and risk a harsher penalty if convicted. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. Dozens of videos from multiple angles showed exactly what had happened. There were hundreds of witnesses. The Royal Guard had filed a formal complaint. Patricia explained that fighting the charges would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. She recommended that Marcus plead guilty, express genuine remorse, and hope that the magistrate would be merciful. It was not the advice Marcus wanted to hear, but it was the advice he needed. The days leading up to his court appearance crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus remained confined to his hotel room, afraid to go out and be recognized. Room service brought his meals. He spent his time reading about British law, researching similar cases, trying to understand the full scope of what he was facing. The pain in his body was gradually easing, but the pain in his heart only intensified as the reality of his situation became clearer. Patricia arranged for Marcus to write a formal letter of apology to the Royal Guard he had shoved. Marcus worked on it for hours, drafting and redrafting, trying to find words adequate to express his regret. How could he apologize for disrespecting someone's duty, their uniform, their country? How could he make amends for behavior that had no excuse? In the end, his letter was simple and direct. He acknowledged his wrongdoing, took full responsibility, and expressed sincere remorse. He did not make excuses or seek sympathy. The guard, whose name Marcus learned was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, accepted the apology through official channels, but declined any personal contact. Patricia explained that this was standard. The guard had a reputation to maintain and could not be seen fraternizing with someone who had assaulted him, even in the context of reconciliation. Marcus understood, though it pained him not to be able to apologize face to face. Meanwhile, the media circus continued to grow. News outlets around the world had picked up the story. Talk shows debated whether the guard's response had been appropriate. Op-ed writers used the incident as a jumping-off point for discussions about tourism, respect, and national pride. Marcus's name became synonymous with entitled American tourists, a label that stung deeply because it was so contrary to how he had always viewed himself. A journalist managed to get Marcus's phone number and called requesting an interview. Marcus declined, following Patricia's advice to avoid any public statements until after the trial. The journalist was polite but persistent, explaining that giving his side of the story might help public opinion. But Marcus knew better. Anything he said would be twisted, analyzed, and used against him. Silence was his only protection. His sister Melissa flew to London to be with him, using her vacation days and her savings to make the trip. Her presence was a comfort Marcus hadn't realized he desperately needed. She held him while he cried, made him eat when he had no appetite, and forced him to leave the hotel room for short walks when the walls seemed to be closing in. She didn't judge him, didn't lecture him, simply stood beside him as only a sister could. The night before the court appearance, Marcus barely slept. He lay awake running through worst-case scenarios. Would he be sent to prison? How would he survive in a foreign jail system? What would happen to his career, his apartment, his entire life back home? The questions circled endlessly through his mind like vultures waiting for death. The morning of the trial, Marcus dressed in the most conservative outfit he had brought. Dark slacks, a white shirt, a borrowed tie from the hotel concierge. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the gaunt, haunted face staring back. He had lost weight from stress. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a terrible mistake and was about to pay for it. Patricia met him outside the courthouse, going over last-minute details. She reminded him to address the magistrate as Your Honor, to speak clearly and respectfully, to show genuine remorse. Marcus nodded, his stomach churning with anxiety. Melissa held his hand as they walked up the courthouse steps, past reporters who shouted questions and camera operators who jostled for the best angle. The courtroom was smaller than Marcus had imagined, less dramatic than what he had seen in movies. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb sound, creating an atmosphere of oppressive solemnity. Other cases were being heard first, giving Marcus time to observe the proceedings and understand the gravity of his situation. Each defendant seemed small and vulnerable before the magistrate's bench, and Marcus knew he would look the same. When his case was called, Marcus stood on shaking legs. The charges were read aloud: assault on a service member and causing public disorder. The words echoed in the quiet courtroom, sounding even more serious when spoken in legal terminology. Patricia entered his guilty plea. her voice confident and professional even as Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. The prosecutor presented the case against Marcus efficiently. She showed videos of the incident, described the disruption caused, and emphasized the serious nature of assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. She noted that such behavior could not be tolerated, and that a strong message needed to be sent to deter others from similar acts. Her words were measured but damning, painting Marcus as a cautionary tale. Patricia gave her statement in Marcus's defense. She acknowledged the seriousness of his actions but emphasized his genuine remorse. His previously clean record, his cooperation with authorities, and the physical and professional consequences he had already suffered. She presented his letter of apology, character references from his employer and community back home, and evidence of his good standing prior to this incident. She argued for leniency, noting that Marcus had already been punished in many ways. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak. He approached the podium with Patricia beside him, his prepared statement trembling in his hands. He began by apologizing directly to Lance Corporal Mitchell, to the other guards, to the people of the United Kingdom whose traditions he had disrespected. His voice cracked with emotion as he described the shame he felt, the regret that consumed him. He explained, without making excuses, how alcohol had impaired his judgment but emphasized that this did not absolve him of responsibility. Marcus spoke about what he had learned from this experience. He talked about the importance of respecting other cultures, of understanding that traditions are not entertainment for tourists, of recognizing that his actions had consequences far beyond the moment they occurred. He acknowledged that he had behaved with appalling disrespect and selfishness. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be better, to be worthy of the second chance he was humbly requesting. The magistrate, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Helena Whitmore, listened to everything with an impassive expression. When Marcus finished speaking and returned to his seat, she took a long moment to review her notes. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Melissa's supportive presence behind him, could sense Patricia's tension beside him. Judge Whitmore began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. She acknowledged Marcus's remorse but noted that remorse alone could not undo the harm caused. She spoke about the importance of the changing of the guard ceremony, about what it represented to the British people, about the discipline and dedication of the guards who perform their duties with such commitment. She emphasized that tourists must understand they are guests and must behave accordingly. The sentence, when it finally came, felt bow. Marcus walked out of the courthouse a convicted man, but also a free one. The relief that washed over him was tempered by the knowledge that his punishment was far from over. The fine would strain his savings, but it was the community service and the permanent mark on his record that would truly define his future. Reporters surrounded him on the courthouse steps, shouting questions and thrusting microphones in his face. Patricia guided him through the crowd with firm professionalism, while Melissa shielded him from the worst of the attention. The community service was arranged through a charitable organization that worked with various community projects throughout London. Marcus was assigned to a program that helped maintain public parks and assisted with youth education initiatives. His supervisor was a no-nonsense woman named Janet Hughes, who made it clear from the first day that she didn't care about his story or his excuses. She cared only about the work he would do and whether he would do it properly. Marcus threw himself into the community service with an intensity that surprised even himself. He spent his mornings picking up litter in Hyde Park, his afternoons helping to paint community centers, his evenings assisting with after-school programs for disadvantaged youth. The physical labor was demanding, especially with his injuries still healing, but he welcomed the exhaustion. It felt like a form of penance, a way to earn back some measure of dignity through honest work. During his third week of service, Marcus met a retired schoolteacher named William Thompson, who volunteered at the same community center. William was in his 70s with white hair and gentle eyes that seemed to see right through people. He struck up a conversation with Marcus during a lunch break, and somehow Marcus found himself telling the whole story. William listened without judgment, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. When Marcus finished, William shared his own story. He had made a terrible mistake in his youth, a drunk driving incident that had nearly cost someone their life. He had spent years trying to make amends, to become someone better than the person who had made that choice. He told Marcus that mistakes don't define us unless we let them, that redemption is always possible for those willing to work for it. Those words stayed with Marcus long after their conversation ended. The youth program Marcus worked with served children from struggling families, many of them dealing with challenges Marcus had never had to face. He helped with homework, supervised activities, and listened to their stories. One boy, a 10-year-old named Jamal, reminded Marcus of himself at that age. Curious, energetic, full of dreams about the future. Watching Jamal struggle with math homework, Marcus realized how much he had taken for granted in his own life. Marcus began to see his punishment not as an ending, but as a beginning. He volunteered for extra hours beyond what was required. He donated money to the programs he worked with. He wrote letters to schools back in California, offering to speak about his experience and the dangers of alcohol abuse. Some schools responded positively, others ignored him, but he kept trying. Each letter felt like another small step toward redemption. Meanwhile, the situation back home was slowly resolving itself. His company's investigation had concluded, and while Marcus would not be returning to his previous position, he was offered a different role with reduced responsibilities and a significant pay cut. It was humbling, but Marcus accepted gratefully. He was being given a second chance, and he understood how rare and precious that was. His relationship with his family had also begun to heal. His parents visited him in London during his final weeks of community service. They saw the work he was doing, met the people he was helping, and recognized that their son was genuinely trying to change. His mother cried when she hugged him goodbye, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of hope. The media attention gradually faded as news stories captured the public's interest. The videos of Marcus's incident were still online, still accumulating views, but they no longer dominated news cycles. Marcus learned to accept that those videos would exist forever, a permanent record of his worst moment. He couldn't change the past, but he could control his response to it. Lance Corporal James Mitchell eventually agreed to meet with Marcus, a meeting arranged through Patricia and the military liaison office. They met in a neutral location, a quiet cafe, away from tourists and cameras. Marcus had prepared another apology, but when he saw Mitchell in civilian clothes looking like any other young man, the words stuck in his throat. Mitchell was polite but reserved, listening as Marcus stammered through his apology. Mitchell finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. He explained that Marcus's actions had affected him more than people realized. He had faced questions about whether he had overreacted, whether the force used was appropriate. His family had worried about him. The incident had complicated something that should have been straightforward, a soldier doing his duty. But Mitchell also acknowledged Marcus's efforts at redemption, the community service, the genuine remorse. He didn't offer forgiveness, not exactly, but he offered something perhaps more valuable, understanding. As his time in London drew to a close, Marcus spent a day visiting the places that had become meaningful to him during his extended stay. He walked through Hyde Park, where he had spent so many hours working. He stopped by the community center where children he had helped now greeted him with enthusiasm. He even returned to Buckingham Palace, standing at a respectful distance to watch the changing of the guard ceremony one final time. This time, Marcus watched with different eyes. He saw the precision and dedication in every movement, the pride and tradition embodied in every gesture. He understood now what he had been too drunk and foolish to appreciate before. These guards weren't tourist attractions, but professional soldiers maintaining a living connection to history. The ceremony wasn't entertainment, but a sacred trust passed down through generations. Janet Hughes gave Marcus his completion certificate for the community service with something that might have been approval in her eyes. She told him that he had worked harder than most people assigned to her program, that he had made a real difference in the community. She handed him letters from some of the children he had worked with, their handwritten thank you notes adorned with drawings and stickers. Marcus had to excuse himself to cry in private when he read them. The flight home to California felt surreal. Marcus carried with him his discharge papers, his court documents, his community service certificate, and those precious letters from the children. He had left for London as one person and was returning as someone entirely different. The physical injuries had healed, leaving only faint scars and occasional aches, but the internal changes were profound and permanent. His apartment in California seemed strange and unfamiliar, filled with belongings that belonged to a person who no longer existed. Marcus spent his first weekend home sorting through his life, deciding what to keep and what to let go. He found photos from before the trip, images of a man who thought he had everything figured out. He barely recognized that person now. Returning to work was difficult. Colleagues who had been friends now kept their distance, unsure how to interact with him. Lunch conversations quieted when he approached. He was assigned to projects that kept him away from client-facing roles. But Marcus accepted it all without complaint. He had made his bed and would lie in it with as much grace as he could muster. Months passed, then a year. Marcus continued the work he had started in London. He volunteered at local community centers in California. He spoke at schools about alcohol awareness and the consequences of poor choices. He donated regularly to the programs he had worked with in London, staying in touch with William Thompson and some of the other volunteers who had become friends. One evening, Marcus received an email from Jamal, the young boy he had helped with homework. Jamal was now excelling in school and wanted to tell Marcus that he had inspired him to work harder. The email was brief and full of spelling errors, but it meant more to Marcus than any professional achievement ever had. He printed it out and kept it on his desk as a reminder of why the pain had been worth it. 2 years after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from Lance Corporal Mitchell, now promoted to corporal. Mitchell wrote that he had followed Marcus's efforts through mutual connections and wanted Marcus to know that he respected the work Marcus had done to change his life. He included a photograph of himself in uniform, inscribed with a simple message: duty, honor, redemption. Marcus framed that photograph and hung it in his apartment. Marcus never fully escaped the shadow of that day at Buckingham Palace. Job applications still required him to disclose his conviction. Background checks still flagged his record. Potential romantic partners still found the videos online. But Marcus learned to meet these challenges head-on, to own his mistake rather than hide from it. He told his story honestly, accepted the consequences, and let his actions speak for his character. On the 3rd anniversary of the incident, Marcus sat down and wrote a letter to his younger self, the man who had stumbled drunk into Buckingham Palace without a thought for consequences. He wrote about the pain that was coming, but also about the growth. He wrote about the community he had served, the children he had helped, the person he